The rain had been falling since before sunrise. Elliot Voss stood on the porch of his farmhouse, drying his hands on an old rag. He heard her footsteps before he saw her too careful for old boards. The sound of someone unsure the wood would hold. She was soaking wet. Dark jacket flat against her shoulders, hair pressed to her face, a clipboard held to her chest. No umbrella. No car he could see along the drive. She looked at him the way people look at something that doesn't match what they expected. Then she straightened. "My name is Sloane Devereaux," she said. "I need a husband before Friday, and according to every file I have, you are the only person I can trust." Elliot looked at her, then out at the rain moving slow across the pasture, then back at her. "Come inside," he said. "You're soaked through." He walked in. She followed. Neither of them said anything else. Sloane Devereaux ran a $4.2 billion company. She had flown to 4 countries in a single week. More than once, she had sat across from senators and fund managers and men who believed their net worth entitled them to speak over her, and she had never once lost the thread of what she wanted. She had never in her adult life driven 4 hours through a rainstorm to ask a stranger for anything. And yet here she was, standing in the kitchen of a Vermont farmhouse that smelled like coffee and damp wood, dripping on a floor that had seen 60 years of mud. What had brought her to this door was not desperation, not the kind she would have named. It was logic, the same logic that had saved Devereaux Holdings once before. She just hadn't anticipated that logic would require her to stand in someone else's kitchen at 8 in the morning, uninvited, leaving a puddle on the linoleum with a small girl at the table watching her over a bowl of oatmeal. This was Maeve. Sloane had not factored in a child. 2 mornings earlier, Elliot had done what he did every morning up before the alarm. Coffee, animals before the light was fully up. Maeve had followed in her rubber boots, a size and a half too large, found at a church sale months ago and impossible to part with. They slapped against the wet grass with each step. "Dad." She squinted at the nearest cow with the gravity of someone conducting a serious examination. "Does Lucy look sad today?" He looked. Lucy was eating. "No," he said, "she's just thinking." Maeve nodded once, with the seriousness of someone who has received a completely satisfying answer. On Saturdays, he drove to the farmer's market in town. People greeted him with nods, the kind that meant you had been here long enough and caused few enough problems to have earned your place. He preferred that to the other kind of recognition. He had lived that other kind for years. It had cost him more than he could easily count. His neighbor Dale Purcell found him near the vegetable tables that same Saturday, holding a crumpled bank loan agreement. He was trying to expand his operation. The bank had sent a contract that looked reasonable if you read the first 3 pages and stopped there. Elliot took the papers. 15 seconds. "The interest rate is variable, not fixed. It's in the appendix on page 9. If prime moves 2 points, your monthly payment goes up more than you're planning for." He turned a page, and there's a cross-collateralization clause. 1 bad season, and the bank can call both properties your new land and your existing farm. Dale stared. "How do you know all that?" Elliot folded the papers and handed them back. "I read a lot," he said, and moved on. That night, after Maeve was asleep, he sat at the old wooden table with his laptop open. Financial transaction records on the screen, a set of numbers he had been watching for 3 years with the patience of someone who understood that waiting was not the same as doing nothing. He stared at the screen for a long time, then he closed the laptop. In the locked drawer of the table, beneath a tray of rubber bands and old envelopes, was a sealed envelope he had carried through 2 moves without opening. The logo in the corner read Hargrove Capital Group, Boston, Massachusetts. Beneath it, face down, was a photograph of a man in a dark suit, standing before a glass tower, looking at the camera with the expression of someone who believed he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He hadn't looked at the photograph in a year. He turned off the light and went to bed. 3 days before Sloane drove to Vermont, she had been standing at the head of the conference table on the 31st floor of Devereaux Holdings' Boston office. The room was glass on 3 sides. The city moved below in miniature, indifferent and precise. Nobody in the room was smiling, which wasn't unusual here, but today the absence had a different quality to it. It felt like held breath. "The clause is not ambiguous," said Briggs, the general counsel, in the flat voice he reserved for bad news carefully emptied of feeling, precise as a closing statement. "To assume full voting control of your father's shares, The succession agreement requires proof of a legal marriage by the date specified. That date is this Friday, your 34th birthday. Sloane already knew this. She had known it for 6 weeks since she had discovered that her cousin Carter Weil had paid someone to find and quietly surface this clause, buried in a codicil her father had added to his will 14 years ago, and apparently forgotten. Carter had not forgotten it. Carter had been looking for it. He sat across from her now with his hands folded on the table, and his expression calibrated with care to suggest concern. He was 51 years old, and had spent 20 of those years building his position inside Devereaux Holdings, with the patient precision of a man who understood that institutions are long games, and the right move is almost always to wait. "We should discuss interim governance arrangements," he said. "Just to ensure continuity during this transition." "We don't need to discuss that," Sloane said, without looking up from her notes. Her assistant Petra had prepared a list of 5 names. Sloane went through them in under 10 minutes. The first had leaked information to a competitor the previous year, confirmed, not alleged. The second had attended a fundraising event for a charity Carter had personally established 3 months ago. The third had signed a consulting agreement with a firm in active litigation against Devereaux Holdings. The fourth lived in London. The fifth had made a comment off the record to a journalist that would be published within the week. Sloane set the list on the table. "Is there anyone else?" Petra hesitated. "There is one more. But he's raising cattle in Vermont." She placed a single page on the table. It was a profile pulled from Hargrove Capital's archived records, cross-referenced with 3 additional sources. Elliot Voss, former CFO. Left the industry in 2019, no announcement, no press release, no explanation of any kind. What the profile described, in the flat language of corporate records, was a man who had discovered an internal fraud scheme in 2018, $200 million, misrouted through subsidiary accounts over 4 years. He had identified it, documented it, and reported it through proper channels. He had not sold the information, had not used it as personal leverage, had done what was right, and then disappeared from the industry as completely as if he had never been part of it. Sloane read the profile twice. Then a third time. "Address?" she said. At the far end of the table, Carter Weil watched her pick up the page, read it, ask for the address. Something moved through his expression in the space between 1 second and the next, not surprise, not concern. Something more deliberate, the expression of a man updating a calculation in real time, very quickly, before anyone in the room noticed him doing it. Nobody at the table was watching Carter. Sloane was already getting up. The fact that a man who had done everything right had vanished so completely was not a coincidence. She intended to leave unexamined. She arrived the next morning in the rain clipboard, 4 hours of driving, and no backup plan, which was a situation she was not accustomed to and had not fully prepared for. She had not expected the kitchen to feel as warm as it did. She had not expected the child to be already awake, already watching. Maeve had finished her oatmeal and was washing her bowl at the sink, with the thoroughness of a small person who had been taught once and decided that was simply the right way to do it. She looked at Sloane once during this process, not unfriendly, not warm, just appraising, then dried her hands carefully and went back to her seat with her coloring book. Sloane set the clipboard on the table and began. She used the tone she used in board meetings, measured, precise, no wasted motion. The succession clause, the Friday deadline, the proposed terms, a legal marriage, 90 days duration, a clean dissolution at the end, full confidentiality on both sides, and a payment of $2 million upon completion. She had rehearsed this on the drive up. She was in the middle of the dissolution conditions when her phone rang. It was Hartley, a board member who had served since her father's time. His voice had the careful softness of a man delivering news he had been told to deliver. Carter had contacted the full board the previous evening. He had described Sloane's trip to Vermont as an attempt to arrange what he called a hired marriage. The information had already reached a journalist at the Globe. There would likely be a story. She lowered the phone. Carter appeared on the screen a moment later. Video call, transferred without her consent. He wore the face of a man performing sympathy. "Sloane, I think we need to consider the optics here. The image of Devereaux Holdings, a CEO, arranging a contract marriage with someone she found on a dairy farm." He stopped exactly where the sentence would do the most damage and let it finish itself in the room. I only want what is best for the company." The board members visible in the call said nothing. Their silence had a shape to it. It agreed. "Dad." It was Maeve. She was at the sink with the dish towel in her hands, looking not at the phone but at her father. Her voice was flat and direct. "Is that man saying mean things about the lady?" Sloane pressed end. She set the phone face down on the table. The kitchen was quiet. The rain on the roof was the only sound. She did not look at Elliot. She was aware of him at the edge of her vision, completely still, expression unchanged through all of it, watching with the patience of someone who had already decided what he thought and was simply waiting to see what came next. She found it more disorienting than anything Carter had said. She reached for the clipboard. "I should go," she said. "You haven't had coffee," Elliot said. Not an invitation. A statement of fact, delivered the same way he might note that the rain was still coming down. She looked at him. She sat back down. She could not have explained why, which was unusual. She was ordinarily very good at explaining herself to herself. There was something in the quality of his stillness that she had not encountered before. Not indifference, something more deliberate than that. The stillness of someone who has decided, long ago, exactly how much of himself to offer, and to whom and when, and who does not revisit that decision under social pressure. She had walked into a farmhouse to offer $2 million and a business arrangement, and somehow she was the one who had just been assessed. He set a mug in front of her and sat across the table. His eyes went to the edge of the clipboard, where the corner of a quarterly report was visible beneath the contract pages. "Did you bring the third quarter financials?" "Why would you need?" "Because what Carter did this morning wasn't spontaneous. He knew you were coming here before you arrived. That means your communications have a problem, and it means he's operating further along his timeline than you think he is." Sloane reached into the portfolio and placed the quarterly report on the table. He read it without speaking. No questions. No notes, just pages turning at an even, unhurried pace. Maeve came and sat beside him with her coloring book, pressing down on the crayons the way she always did, so the colors came out dense and certain. She didn't ask what he was reading. She simply settled in beside him in a silence that had been practiced between the two of them for years and was entirely comfortable. Sloane checked her watch. Then again. Then a third time, and made herself stop. Elliot did not check his watch. He did not look up. He did not ask questions or flip back and forth the way people do when they are working to understand something unfamiliar. He turned each page completely before moving to the next, working through the document with the focused calm of someone reading something they already have the full framework for. The rhythm was so steady, it was almost meditative, the sound of someone for whom this was not effort but habit. Sloane had 12 people on her finance team. They reviewed this report every quarter together, laptops open, coffee going cold, talking through the numbers, asking each other questions, triangulating. It had taken them the better part of an afternoon. He finished in 19 minutes. He turned the report back to face her and placed his finger on a line in the footnotes on page 31. "The Meridian Project cash flow has been redirected since August. It's going into an intermediate account that isn't on your operating ledger." He tapped the account number. "This is not an accounting error. Someone who understood your internal reporting structure put it exactly where your standard quarterly review wouldn't catch it." She looked at the number for a long time. Not one of her 12 people had flagged this line. Elliot stood and carried his mug to the counter. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the rain on the pasture, hands resting lightly on the edge of the sink. He did not offer to explain further. He did not turn around. He had read 47 pages of financial documentation in 19 minutes, and found the one line that mattered. He had not announced it as remarkable. He had not looked up to see if she was paying attention. He had simply done it and moved to the window, as if the only interesting question was what came next. Sloane looked at the account number on page 31, then at the window, then at the back of his head. She had driven 4 hours to find someone useful. Someone who could stand in a room and hold a title for 90 days without causing an incident. She had categorized this task accordingly: logistically complex, personally distasteful, practically necessary. She had filed it in the same mental folder as other things she had done for the company that she would not discuss at dinner. She had not expected to sit across a kitchen table from someone who had just read 47 pages of internal financial reporting in 19 minutes and found the one line that her 12-person finance team had missed in a full afternoon. She had not expected to feel, for the first time in 6 days, that the problem might be solvable, or that she might not be the most prepared person in the room. "Stay through tonight," he said, without turning from the window. "There's more to go through." She said nothing, but she didn't reach for her clipboard, and he didn't ask her to. She stayed. The guest room had a blue quilt and a window that looked at a dark pasture, and she lay awake for a long time listening to the rain slow and eventually stop. When she got up at 3 for water, Elliot was still at the table, the laptop open in front of him, the screen the only light in the kitchen. He didn't look up. She went back to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle. The email from her attorney arrived at 7:42 the next morning. Carter had collected signatures from 3 board members on a petition for an emergency session to be held Thursday, one day before her deadline, to revisit the succession clause on the grounds of leadership instability. If the session happened, and the board voted Carter's way, she would not simply delay her claim on the controlling shares. She would lose it permanently. At the same moment, Elliot turned his laptop to face her. The intermediate account that the Meridian funds were flowing into traced through 2 shell layers to a limited liability company registered in Delaware, incorporated in March of 2019, 1 month before Elliot Voss had left Hargrove Capital. She looked at the dates, then at him. He was watching through the window. Maeve had gone outside despite the fine drizzle still falling, crouching near the fence post, examining something in the mud with the total absorption of a child who has found something important. Then Maeve's boot slipped on the wet grass. She went down hard on one knee, and for a moment she just sat in the mud, looking at her leg with an expression of pure surprise. Elliot was already moving. He had the first aid box from the cabinet before Sloane had fully processed what happened. He went outside and crouched beside Maeve and said something low and quiet that didn't carry through the glass. His hands moved through the process, cleaning the scrape, checking it, wrapping it with the efficient calm of someone who had done this before, not many times but enough to know exactly what the next step was without having to think about it. He said something else. Maeve laughed, a small surprised sound. He touched the top of her head. He carried the box inside. He washed his hands. He looked up at Sloane. "You need to decide before noon." She was still holding her phone. "Decide what?" "How much you trust me," he said. He dried his hands and put the towel down. There was nothing complicated in the way he said it, just the question itself, patient and plain, offered the same way he had offered her coffee that morning. Not pressure, not performance. Just the next thing that needed to be said. She didn't answer right away. She was watching the place near the fence where Maeve had stood back up and was already back at her drawing in the mud, boots streaked with dirt, entirely over it, already on to the next thing. Sloane thought about page 31. About 12 people who reviewed reports like that every quarter and had not flagged that line. She thought about what it meant to find something in 19 minutes that a team of professionals had missed in an afternoon, and to say nothing about it, to simply move to the window and look at a field, as if the remarkable thing about what had just happened was only the question of what came next. She thought about Carter's face in the fraction of a second, before he composed it, not the face of a man who had been surprised, but of someone recalculating, someone who had already prepared for multiple outcomes and was simply updating his position as new data arrived. She thought about the sealed envelope, about a man who had been carrying something for 3 years without rushing, without acting before the moment was right, with the settled certainty of someone who understood that patience and inaction were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was everything. "Noon," she said. "Okay." He nodded once. He walked back to the window. The drizzle had stopped. The pasture was showing its color again in the pale morning light, green coming back under the gray. The silence that followed was easier than she expected. At noon, she placed the contract on the kitchen table. This version had been drafted by her firm's lead transactional attorney, 12 pages, every material term addressed with precision, reviewed by 3 additional partners before she left Boston. The attorney had 20 years of experience and was not someone who missed things. Elliot sat down and read it the way he did everything, no hurry, no performance. He turned each page completely before moving to the next. When he finished, he turned back to page 7. "This confidentiality provision," he said, "if Carter initiates litigation against the marriage, and he will, his attorneys can argue the clause is unenforceable because it was entered under conditions that constitute duress. As written, the provision doesn't account for that argument. If they succeed, everything you're protecting becomes discoverable in the resulting proceedings. He looked at her. Your attorneys missed it. She said nothing. She looked at page 7. He picked up a pen from the jar on the table and made 2 small marks, one in the margin of page 7, one near the bottom of page 11. Specific carve-out language at both of these points. With that in place, the clause holds even under legal challenge. She looked at the marks, then at him. Where did you go to law school? I didn't. He put the pen down and placed his hands flat on the table. I'll sign this. But I have one condition. She had prepared herself for this. If it's the compensation, not the money. His voice was level and unhurried. I need access to the complete transaction record between Devereaux Holdings and Hargrove Capital, 2018 through 2020. Those are confidential internal records, because Carter Weil used my name to authorize a transaction I never signed. He held her eyes. Before I walk into that boardroom on Friday, I need to be standing on something solid enough to hold both of us. She looked at him for a long moment. He looked back without the forward lean of someone who needs to be understood. He simply waited, the way he seemed to do everything with the patience of someone who has decided that what matters is rarely urgent, and what is urgent rarely matters. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough, he said. And you've been sitting here, waiting. Yes. She let out a slow breath. She looked at the 2 small marks in the margins of a document that 4 attorneys had reviewed and cleared. She thought about the profile, about what it described. A man who had found $200 million misrouted over 4 years, had documented it, reported it, and told no one outside proper channels, who had not sold the information, who had not used it as leverage to improve his own position, who had simply done what was right and then disappeared from the industry as completely as a stone dropped in a deep lake. She had read that profile 3 times in a Boston boardroom and thought she understood what it meant. She understood it differently now, sitting at this kitchen table with the cups still on the counter, and the rain still moving across the pasture outside, and a man across from her who had found in 19 minutes what 12 of her trained professionals had not found in an afternoon, and had said nothing about it, and had moved to the window, and had waited. Then Maeve appeared in the doorway. She was carrying a plate with oatmeal cookies arranged in a careful circle, 8 of them, placed with the deliberate precision of a child who wants things to look right before presenting them. She crossed to the table and set the plate in the exact center of the space between the 2 adults. She looked at neither of them. Then she turned and walked back out into the hallway, her footsteps fading on the old wood floor. Sloane looked at the plate. Then, at the door, she picked up the pen. She signed on the line. She did not ask any more questions. I'll have the files to you tonight, she said. Elliot nodded once. He signed beneath her name, returned the pen to the jar, and picked up his mug. The kitchen was quiet. The deal was made. That night she sent the files 847 pages through a secure link. Elliot acknowledged receipt with 2 words. She went to bed on the blue quilt and woke once in the night and did not check whether he was still at the table. She already knew. In the morning he was there with the locked drawer open in front of him. He had carried the envelope for 3 years through 2 moves, through a winter that nearly broke the furnace, through 6 months when the farm ran at a loss, and he made calculations at this table in the dark that he didn't share with anyone. Each time he had placed the envelope in a locked drawer and left it, not from fear of what was inside, because he had been waiting for the moment when opening it would mean something beyond his own private accounting. He used a kitchen knife on the seal. Inside was a transfer agreement, dated September 2019. It authorized the movement of $340 million in Hargrove Capital assets into a private holding entity. The signature at the bottom read Elliot Voss, Chief Financial Officer. He placed it on the table in front of Sloane without a word, and put his finger on the signature. She looked at it for a long time. She had seen his actual signature in the background file on his resignation letter, on several internal memos. What was on this document was not quite the same, close enough to pass a casual review, not close enough to survive a forensic examination. She opened her laptop and went to page 203 of the Devereaux file. Another transfer agreement. 2021. Same account structure, same routing pattern, same signature. 2 years after Elliot Voss had ceased to exist in the industry. He kept using your name, she said. After you were gone, he didn't stop. Elliot looked out the window. Maeve was at the fence again, drawing in the mud with a stick. I found the 2019 document a week after he filed it. I already had documentation on the earlier fraud, the $200 million from 2018. I was ready to go to the SEC. A pause. My wife was in the hospital. 6 weeks already. The bills were significant. Fighting Carter in court would take years I didn't have. He came to see me. He offered to resolve the medical debt, all of it, if I walked away from the industry permanently and said nothing. He stopped. Outside, Maeve stood up and looked at her drawing with her head tilted. I said yes, he said. And I left. Sloan looked at the document on the table. And then you came here. And then I waited. He turned from the window. I could not act without internal Devereaux records. Everything I had pointed in one direction, but it was only my side of it. I needed documents that only a sitting CEO could legally provide. He met her eyes. When Carter started accelerating the board maneuvering, the petition, I knew he was getting close. I knew eventually someone would need something from me. I just had to be ready when they arrived. You knew I was coming. I knew someone was. She was quiet. How long were you willing to wait? As long as it took. His voice didn't change. Maeve needed me here. Not in depositions, not in proceedings that would put her father in the news for something a 6-year-old couldn't understand. He looked at his daughter through the glass. She had turned from her drawing and was looking up at the gray sky with her face tilted back, the way children do when they feel a change in weather before anyone else does. I would have waited until she was old enough to hear it. However long that was, Sloan looked at the document, then at the window, then, quietly, "How many years have you been carrying this alone?" Elliot looked at Maeve through the glass. 3, he said. Sloan looked at the envelope still open on the table, the document inside, and the 3 years it represented. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she closed the laptop. They signed the marriage license on Thursday morning at the county clerk's office in a room that smelled like old carpet and printer toner. 2 witnesses. Doris, who had done this enough times that her signature was nearly a reflex, and Dale Purcell, who had driven over without being asked, and stood through the brief formality with the expression of a man who had found himself more moved than he expected. Maeve sat in a plastic chair in the hallway with her coloring book, her booted feet swinging well above the floor. On Friday morning, Sloan walked into the Devereaux Holdings boardroom at 9:15, 14 people. Carter at the far end with his attorney. 3 board members who had signed the petition in their usual chairs. The room had the particular stillness of people who believe something is already decided. Sloan placed the marriage certificate on the table. The succession clause is satisfied. Carter looked at the document without visible reaction. The board will need time to review and verify, then verify it, Sloan said. She sat down. Carter opened his presentation and moved through it with the unhurried confidence of a man who had rehearsed every word. Financial irregularities in the Meridian project. Leadership instability, concerns about quarterly numbers, slide after slide. Each one a piece of an argument built over months, designed to make everyone in the room believe Devereaux Holdings was failing, and that Sloan Devereaux was why. 3 board members nodded at the expected moments. Sloan did not interrupt. She watched Carter the way she watched things she was about to dismantle, with the understanding that the right moment is never the first one available. Elliot sat in the row of chairs along the wall behind her. Dark blue shirt, the only one he owned that wasn't flannel. Hands on his knees, eyes on Carter, nothing in his posture drawing attention from anyone. He said nothing for 40 minutes. Carter reached the end. In the interest of the company, I move that we proceed immediately to a vote on interim governance authority. Elliot stood up. He walked to the table and placed a thin folder on the glass surface. No announcement. No pause. The way he set things down in his own kitchen, because it was simply the next thing that needed to happen. He looked at the board. Not at Carter. At the 14 people around the table. "My name is Elliot Voss," he said. His voice was level and not loud. "I was the chief financial officer of Hargrove Capital Group until 2019. I did not leave voluntarily. The man at the end of this table used my signature to authorize the transfer of $340 million into a private holding entity he controlled while my wife was dying in a hospital, and I did not have the resources to fight him in court. He came to me and made an offer. I accepted it. I walked away from my career and agreed to stay silent. Not one person in the room moved. I have been silent for 3 years. I stayed silent because my daughter needed me present, and not in a legal battle I wasn't ready to win. Today, I am ready. He placed a second folder next to the first. Inside, the two forged signature documents, side by side, with a certified forensic analysis from a handwriting expert in Philadelphia, notarized 5 days ago. Bank transfer logs tracing the funds through shell layers to entities in Carter's name. Internal emails from Carter's account directing the structuring of those transactions. And an audio recording from April 14, 2019, a meeting at Hargrove Capital. Carter's voice was clear. The offer was stated with complete specificity. The dollar amount of the medical debt was named aloud. Carter looked at the recorder in the folder. For the first time that morning, something happened in his face that was not a calculation. It lasted less than 2 seconds. The look of a man who has understood that a thing is finished. A board member named Adler, 9 years on the board. One of the 3 who had signed the petition raised her hand. "I would like to withdraw my name from the petition," she said. The vote was 9-1. Carter Weil was removed from the board and from all advisory roles, effective immediately. While the room reorganized itself around the aftermath, Elliot picked up his phone and walked to the window. The city was gray and unchanged behind the glass. Sloane watched him from her seat. He was texting Maeve. "Hey, almost done. What do you want for dinner tonight?" She read it twice. Then she looked away. The drive back to Vermont took 4 hours. She did it in the same car she had driven up in 4 days earlier, the rain entirely gone, the hills rolling past in the pale gold light of late afternoon. She hadn't called ahead. She hadn't figured out what she was going to say. Somewhere near the Connecticut border, she had simply gotten in the car and started driving north. The farm looked entirely different in the sun. In the rain, it had been muted and gray, a shape at the end of a wet drive. In the afternoon light, it had depth, the green of the pastures, the weathered white of the barn, the fence line tracing its patient way toward the tree line. It was a real thing. Solid. She sat in the car for a moment before getting out. Maeve heard the car first. She came running out in her socks, which her father had certainly told her not to wear outside, and stopped at the edge of the porch with a wide, unsurprised smile. "Miss Sloane, Dad said you might not come back." Sloane stood at the foot of the path. "He said that?" "Yeah." Maeve considered this without judgment. "But I told him he's usually wrong about stuff like that." She turned and ran inside. "Dad!" She came back. Elliot came out a minute later. He looked at her from the porch in the evening light without surprise, which she now understood meant he was paying close attention. He came down 2 steps and stopped. She stood at the bottom of the path with nothing in her hands. "I want to apologize," she said. "When I first came here, the way I looked at this place, the way I looked at you, I thought I knew what I was seeing." "You don't need to apologize for that," he said. "Then what do I need to apologize for?" He was quiet for a moment. He came down the last 2 steps and sat on the bottom one, forearms on his knees, looking out at the field where the light was long and going gold. "For thinking a person can be valued by what they're doing," he said, "instead of what they've chosen not to do." Sloane stood still. Then she sat down on the step beside him. He hadn't made room. She sat down anyway, and there was room. The field was quiet. The air had turned cool and smelled like grass and the beginning of evening. Somewhere in the pasture, one of the cows moved through the long grass with the unhurried certainty of something that has nowhere else to be. Maeve appeared in the doorway. She was holding 2 glasses of apple juice pressed carefully together in both hands, her tongue at the corner of her mouth. She came down the steps and placed 1 glass beside Sloane and 1 beside her father, then settled herself against Elliot's arm with the easy certainty of a child who has been doing this her whole life. She looked out at the field. Nobody said anything. Nobody mentioned 90 days or what came next. The sun went down behind the Vermont hills the way good things end, without announcement, without hurry. Maeve rested her head against her father's shoulder. Sloane looked at the last pale edge of light. Elliot sat still and looked at nothing in particular, the way a person sits when they are used to silence and have finally learned to tell the kinds apart. Neither of them had been looking for this, but the step was old and solid and held all 3 of them without difficulty, and the evening came impatient from the east, and neither of them moved to go inside.